the simpler method. But again, I want to get some practice entering in doing by hand SQL statements. Okay, so then I click Next. And it shows me my SQL statement the way it is now. Select star from employee. Now, we know we want to say where, and what was the field? Emp name. We know we don't want it to be equal, we want it to be like. And what do we want it to be like? Well, let's say we're going to look for the name anywhere, what we've typed in anywhere on the name, anywhere in the name. So in other words, if I typed in, let's see, if I typed in ILL, all right, it would pick up Willie and William and Bill and Billy and so on, and Jill. It would pick up all of those. So I want my name to be like percentage sign plus question mark plus percentage sign. Let's look at this a little closer. One thing my students seem to have a trouble with is when you put things in quotation marks and when you don't. And in general, if you're talking about an instruction or a variable name, you don't put them in quotes. But if you're talking about some sort of hard-coded string value, some set of characters that isn't referring to the name of something, but is actually the value that you want to use, you put it in quotes. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to surround the blank in my query with 2 percentage signs. Why 2 percentage signs? Because that's what you put in if you want to do an approximate search. So percent plus my blank plus percent. So when the server gets to executing this, the SQL statement is going to look something like this. If I were to say, if I were to type in the box, name like ILL, all right? That's actually the SQL statement it's going to be executing. It's going to take the percent sign, add to it the value from the text box. We'll get to that, how you do that in a second. And then finally, add a percent sign to the end. And that's what we come up with. All right. If you do a plus with string values, it's typically treated as a concatenation. We'll simply put one string right after another. And again, those 2% signs are sort of the wild cards in this. And then the question mark represents the value from the text box. Okay. So, that's what we have here. A question mark in a SQL statement like this, it represents a parameter. All right? Think of a parameter as a blank in the statement. A blank that's going to get filled in at runtime. We'll see more and more examples of this, but this is our first instance of this. Now, what do you suppose we have to do? We have to identify where that blank is going to be filled in from. In other words, where does that parameter get its value from? So I'll press Next, and it's asking me, that first parameter, where does it get its value from? And it could get its value from a number of different places. It could get its value from a cookie. All right. For example, if it was remembering who is logged on, maybe it would contain the user ID in a cookie, and it would retrieve that. Or maybe it's getting it from the query string, or this place or that place. In our case, it's coming from a control. is coming from something on the page. What on the page is it coming from? It's coming from the value of that text box. So I will say that I want the value of that parameter to come from the control. What control do I want? Well, I want the value to come from text box name, txt name. So what this is telling me is in this blank, that's represented by the question mark, ASP.NET is going to fill that blank in with the value that I've entered into the text box. So whatever I typed in there is going to get enclosed by 2% signs, and that's going to be the criteria I'm going to use in my where clause to pull up the people. All right. And I can finish. All right. It notices that I've changed the SQL statement, so it asks me if I want to regenerate it. Since I haven't really done anything, I'm not returning different data. I'm simply using a criteria to only pull up some of the data. I'm going to answer no. If I were to answer yes, it would wipe out that my headers and any customization I did and recreate it. All right. So now I can go in and run this. Okay, I'm looking for a person, and his name was Mike or Michael or something, so I'm going to type in MI there. And there the search goes and pulls up Mike. Or, gee, was it Joe or Joseph or Jim or something like that? Pulls up Joe. Finally, I don't know what kind of person would think this way, but I don't remember the name of the person, but I do remember their first name had an E in it. In which case it pulls up both Joe and Mike. What are the key things to this? The key things to this is there are blanks in our SQL statement that are going to get filled in at runtime. We're going to see this all over the place. One place, that we're seeing it now is when you're doing a query. Because if you think about it, again, if you're searching a site, very rarely you want to see everything in the database. You want to filter it down and narrow it down based on some criteria. So therefore, there's going to likely to be a where clause associated with it. So we're going to search by name or by product code or by course ID or by description or by author or by whatever. All right? We're going to do some sort of search. Now, wherever we have blanks in the SQL statement, those are called parameters, and they're represented by a question mark. Now, the one thing that we have to do with that question mark is we have to tell it where it's getting its value from. We don't know what the values are because the values could be whatever people are searching for. All right? But we have to tell it where to get the value from, and that's where we connect that text box that we created with our parameter in the SQL statement. Questions about this? Let's look at the code for good measure. Notice our select statement is a little different because it has that criteria in there. And then we specify the select parameters and where it's getting the value for that parameter. Questions about this? Yes?
Can you skip putting that question mark in and just put the name of the control in its place?
Don't think so. The reason I don't think so is how is it going to know that that name of the control is a name of a control and not just maybe a column and table in the database. For example, in this case it would be text name dot value, right? The database is going to look at text name dot value and think, oh, there must be a table called text name, and I want to pull up its value property. All right? Well, there is no table because it's not a table in the database, it's a control. So because of that, that's why you got to kind of have to do it this way.
I see.
The question mark sort of tells ASP.NET, hey, don't treat this at face value. This represents a parameter. Get the value for the parameter and place it in there. All right. Here's the next thing we're going to... Yeah, go ahead.
Could you have more than one parameter?
Oh, sure. Sure. If I wanted to pick, let's say, if I wanted to pick, let's say, search by name and department, for example, in this case. So I might want to search for Joe, or I might want to search for Joe in the accounting department. Then you could go and you could have two things. You then need two visual controls, right? Maybe something for the department, something for the name. You'd need then the SQL statement to have both parameters in there in the proper place, and then you need to associate those parameters with the control. But yeah, absolutely.
Well, actually, what I was thinking of is if you had a text box for first name, last name, but you had first name, last name as one field, can you have two question marks in the same?
Could you have two question marks on the same? That's a good question. In practice, if you're doing a name, you'd always break it down to first name and last name. You remember, with any of this, you can custom code your a solution to a lot of these things that you're doing. But again, by a little bit better database design, you could, I would not, for example, if I had one giant name column, I wouldn't then give a first name and last name text box. All right. What I would do, though, probably is I wouldn't have a single name field then. I'd have a first name field, and then I could have the two text boxes, and there would be no problem. All right, here's what we're going to do now. We're going to build a drop-down for department, and when the user picks that drop-down, picks from the drop-down, it's going to bring up the people that are in that department. All right? Okay, so let's think about what we want to do. Let's make sure we're clear on what we want to do, and then we'll discuss how to do it. And again, this in my mind is design, right? It's not picking out the pretty colors or anything, but it's thinking through your problem before you're doing it. Yeah, I know it gets bright in here when you switch back and forth. So, our new page is going to look something like this. Select star from employee where department ID equals some parameter. All right? We want to filter by, again, remember this is a completely new page. We want to be able to search by department and show all the employees for a given department. We're not doing any name searches or anything now. So, our select statement, select star from employee where department ID equals question mark. And that question mark will get filled in at runtime. All right? Now, let's finish through the thought, and then we'll go. Yeah, well, let's work through that. I'm forming some questions and some options in my head, but I don't want to muddy the water. What's my UI going to look like? What's my user interface going to look like? We're going to have our grid view, that's going to show the results, then what am I going to have up here to allow the user to pick which department they want to see? Set a drop down. All right. Why not a text box? Yeah, because people don't know what the numbers associated with the departments are, right?
Would you want to put the department name, not the number?
Well, hold on. All right. If I put a text box with that SQL statement, I would have to put in a number, right?
Oh, yeah, that one.
Right. Okay, and this is the example we're thinking through. So with this one, I would have to put the number in there. I don't want to put the number in there. Now, what if we decided to put the name in the text box instead of the number? Well, then you'd have to somehow translate that name into a number. And you'd have to write some logic to do that, and not saying that you couldn't do that. You could make a more extensive SQL statement that looked up that, and you could do it. It's doable, all right, mind you. But it's probably not a good idea, all right? Better off instead to have a drop-down, all right? Because the drop-down is going to limit them to the valid choices. And the drop-down is going to accommodate both of the interested parties in this transaction, all right? Who are the interested parties in this transaction? Well, there's a user that's trying to look up employees, all right? And they don't know these ID numbers. They only know the name of the department, right? So that's the first interested party, the user that's doing the search. The second interested party is the web server and the ASP.NET framework that is trying to do this query and needs to know the department ID. So, the query needs to know the department ID. The user doesn't know the department ID, only uses department name. What a perfect situation for a drop-down. Because, as we all remember from our HTML class, a drop-down allows us, for every option, to have two things. Have a value that the user sees, and then have a value that's used behind the scenes in any sort of scripting. So, for example, if I was coding this drop-down, and let's say I forget what departments I actually have in here. So I'll make some up. Associated with every option in a drop-down are two values. This one, which the user sees, and this one that is going to be used behind the scenes. So we're accommodating both parties, both interested parties. We're giving the user the ability to select based on the name that they know for the department. We're able then to have the value of the ID that the script can use. Okay? So that's sort of a good situation all the way around. Now, we've used drop-downs before, if I'm not mistaken, in this class. We created some drop-downs. All right? How did we do it? We went in and created a drop-down, and then we went in and we created items for that drop-down, and we put in the value and the text for each item. All right? Are we going to do that here? Are we going to go in and manually put in the different values and different text values for the different departments? Yes.
Can it just read it from the database?
Exactly. I hope we don't have to do that because that's already in the database, right? The whole benefit of doing this using database-driven websites is that if the database changes, it automatically gets reflected. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a drop down on this page that's going to have its own data source. And that data source is going to pull the values from the department table and create a drop down for it. So, to sort of complete our design, what are we going to have to do this? We're going to have a drop down. A data source to populate that drop down. We are then going to have a grid view. And we're going to have a data source for the grid view that uses the value from the drop-down. Now, a lot of times when students first are exposed to this, they think that they're going to do this in one data source. All right? That's not the case. These are two different pieces of data. Let's think about, let's describe in words what the two different pieces of data are. This data source is simply a list of all the departments. Has nothing to do with the employees, right? I'm not saying I want only the departments that have a certain number of employees or anything like that. I want to see a list of every single department in the database. What's my verbal description of this? My verbal description of this is I want to see every employee whose department matches the department I've chosen. Those are two different things, right? This list has nothing to do with employees. It's just a list of every department that is there. This list is a list of employees. Now we're using the department to filter that out, but again, it's a list of employees. So since these represent conceptually two different groups of data, they're two data sets. All right? A very common mistake for students is to try to think in terms of just making like one data set that does everything. That's sort of swimming upstream. That's going against the flow of how these things work naturally. We'll see more examples of that going forward. So let's go and let's create this page from scratch to do this. And I'm going to do a piece at a time. All right? One other thing I might need is a button, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. So let's go in and create our new file. Web form. I'll call it department search. Now let's start building our page. I'll do this in design view. I'm going to go put my drop-down list here. And back in our earlier examples, we were going here and editing items and going in and manually adding those in. Now, that's probably not a good idea here because, again, we want that to be tied to the database. So I'm not going to manually enter items in here. Instead, I'm going to create a SQL data source. All right. And I'll go in and configure some parameters for it. DS departments. What database do I want to use? Well, I want to use the HR database. Remember, once you've created that connection string and stored it in there, you want to use that for everything else. Next. What do I want to see? I'll take the easy way out here. I want to see everything from the department table. And I want it ordered by department name. So I'm going to add an order by clause to it. I can test it out. And then I can finish. All right. So now I have a data source that contains a list of the departments. But I'm not showing that data anywhere, right? The data source object is just sort of the collection of data that is gathered. We're not presenting it anywhere as of yet. Where we want to present it is we want to put it in a drop-down. So what we can do is we can go in and bind, choose data source, and I can say I want the data for this drop-down to come from DS departments, and I can choose what do I want displayed. The display value is going to be what the user is going to see. Well, I don't want to see the department ID, right? I want to show the user the department name. What is going to be the value sort of behind the scenes that's going to be available to the scripts? Well, that is going to be the department ID. So I'll go and create that. And now I see it says data bound. That means that it's attached to that data source. Before, previous to that, it said unbound, which meant that if I don't type some values in there, there aren't going to be any values. Let me go and add my button. And I'm going to test it at this point. Why do I test it at this point? Well, I think it's generally good practice to do a bit of coding and then test. So many people I see try to do everything all at once, and it just causes them grief. All right, and there we have the different departments. Now, nothing happens yet, right, because we haven't wrote the second part of it, but we've shown that we have the list of departments. Let's do a view source to see what's really going on and what really came to this page from the server. What came to this page is, again, as I designated, option, value, that represents a department ID. This represents the name of the department. That's what's going to be intelligible to users, whereas the value is what the script needs. Now, if we can back up for a second to our discussion of database design. Remember I said that I kind of prefer single part keys to double part keys? Well, this is one of the reasons. All right? Especially in web applications, if I'm going to represent a table in a drop-down, I only have one value associated with it. All right? And therefore, I kind of want it to be the primary key. And if it's a single part key, that's easy to do. If it's a multiple part key, I really don't know what to do other than going back and changing it to be a single part key. All right? So, in web applications, the whole passing data around from page to page to page is important. And because of that, single part keys look really attractive. All right, so that's typically why, one of the reasons I use single part keys. All right, let's build the rest of this. So I will go in and put my other data source on here.